So I think where we're seeing this shift is we're having less geographic accents that tie to localness and more ideological accents that tie to belief systems and values. And there's been actually some really interesting literature on how politics has shaped us sounding different. Ideologically, we're moving in ways that I actually think will shape our speech so that dialects and accents are not dead, they're just changing their nature.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Sociolinguist and author Valerie Fridland returns to our podcast to discuss accents, dialects, and her new book, Why We Talk Funny.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. We are delighted to welcome back sociolinguist, author, and professor Dr. Valerie Fridland.
For those of you who are new to our podcast, Valerie first joined us back in season 11. Her 2023 book, Like Literally Dude, shared her insights on the deep cultural and historical significance of what we might call quote-unquote bad English.
Today, we will hear all about her new book on accents and why we talk funny. Welcome back to Speaking of Language, Valerie.
Thank you. I'm really, really excited to be here.
You've done it again, Valerie. Your newest book, titled Why We Talk Funny, The Real Story Behind Our Accents, just hit bookstores. Before we get into that real story, what is an accent and why do accents even exist?
You know, a lot of people think accents are the same thing as dialects, that they're sort of just varieties. And while they are part of what make up a dialect that we notice, an accent specifically is about the sounds a speaker says. So when you and I may be speakers of the same language but have different dialects, so I'm Southern, for example, and you're Northern, one of the things that's most salient about the differences between us is probably the way we pronounce certain things. So as a Southerner, I might say ba, ba, ba. And as a Northern, you'd say bye-bye. That difference is a difference in accents. So dialects have differences on all different levels, from differences in vocabulary, like the fact that I know that a Coke is the right way to order a soft drink. And also syntax. So again, I could say Mike could as a Southerner, and probably no one else can. But when we're interested in just the sounds that differ between us and the way that we pronounce things, that's an accent.
Excellent. Thanks for that clarification.
So what prompted your exploration of this new topic?
You know, a lot of what I had written about in the last book was really about the questions people come to me with. So the last book was about sort of speech habits people find annoying, or they call them tics. And people would often ask me about how people got to say them, or, you know, a lot of times they'd be like, please don't let people say this, as if I had that power. But that really drove that book. But the bread and butter of what I've done my whole career is really look at accents and dialects. And this is really personally interesting to me because I grew up in the South, which people know for its accents, right? So Southern American English is probably one of the most stereotyped accents there is, especially in the United States, as having a lot of sort of friendly, sweet, kind, hospitable, but dumb, uneducated, lazy-esque association. So there's a lot that goes into the attitudes we have to accents. But also my parents were immigrants, and they both spoke French natively. And so I grew up not only being in a place that was well known for its accent, but I had parents that had accents in a place that was also very skeptical of external accents. And so I was so aware of the power of accents socially as a child that even though, you know, no part of my 10-year-old self thought, I'm going to be a linguist, I think that probably shaped me and my interest in accents, which is what I ended up studying. So my dissertation was actually on the Southern accent. And most of the work I've done in my research in my day job is on accents, on sounds. And so this was more my passion project, I guess, than the first one in terms of what I'm interested in. And it's also something, I mean, everybody has an accent, and who doesn't have an accent story?
I don't have an accent.
No, you don't. Of course, I was thinking, except for you.
Oh, my goodness. So, Valerie, let's dig into this book. It includes 3 what you call sound bites, and you just mentioned things people find annoying. I was quite entertained by your musings on the word, and I'm going to say it.
Pardon the interruption. Speaking of language, listeners, this is a warning that we are about to discuss a word, a synonym for wet or damp, that many people find gross. If you'd rather not hear it, skip ahead 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Starting now.
Moist. And
Should there be a trigger warning?
There might, we might need to add that.
I'll edit in, if you're made uncomfortable by this word.
Yeah, exactly.
Skip ahead.
Yeah. Well, AI can do all of that now for us automatically. So first of all, I'm interested if you are at liberty to confirm or deny whether you despise hearing this word like 20% of the population.
I don't personally hate the word, although
Okay.
now that I've written about it and kind of understand why it's so repulsive, I find that it bothers me more. But actually, the funny story is I have a very, very good friend who's actually Australian, and we have lots of fun with her accent because whenever we go out to dinner, for some reason, even though she's highly intelligible, right? It's not a matter of intelligibility, but it's this idea of the cognitive dissonance. I think when people come up and I have an American accent and we're in a place where that's what they expect, and then she tries to order, and the 100% of the time, the waiter is like, "I'm sorry." They can never get her order the first time, so that's sort of our little accent joke, but. She hates the word moist, like cannot hear it. So I take great pleasure in bringing it up at every dinner. So I'll be like, oh, this is such moist chicken, or what a delicious moist cake. It's sort of been a joke between us. So when I was writing this book about sounds, I wanted to have, it's about accents and the history and science behind accents. But I also wanted to have some fun with sounds and things that people think about and talk about with sounds. And so that's where the soundbite chapters came in, where they're just sort of these little interludes in between the more, meaty chapters. And that seemed like a really perfect one because after she was cringing every time I said it, I thought, well, I need to find out exactly what it is about the word that bothers people, because so many people then told me they hate that word. And I'm not personally one of them, but I know I have a lot of friends who are moist disturbed. So how about you? Are you a moist hater?
I don't know. I think I am trending toward finding it annoying, but I'm not. I have no complete aversion. Sam, what about you?
Yeah, no, I've it's been, people have explained to me that they feel that way enough that I'm like, I guess I get it, but it's never had that impact on me. I like a nice, chocolate lava cake.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Who doesn't? You're right.
So, Valerie, tell us, why do we like or dislike how certain words sound?
There's a whole area of study of this that looks at, not only sounds in words, but sounds more generally, and whether they have sort of inherent meaning or maybe aesthetic properties that are associated with them that kind of encourage us to like or dislike them. With the word moist, there are 2 things at play. There's the idea of what it gets associated with. So the semantic associations that we have with that word, moist basements are not usually places you want to be. And we also see it in medical literature, a lot of times, moist wounds. So none of those are words associated that are positive. And I think, anytime we have things that describe things that mean something gross or uncomfortable, we tend to not like that word. So pus, for example, is nobody's favorite either. Not on the top favorite of lists, right? Pus, gangrene, things like that. Don't like them. So moist gets associated with those kinds of words.
Right.
That drives it semantically. But even more general, when we look at the way that sounds make us feel, there's actually a lot of literature that looks at how sounds might have some sort of intrinsic aesthetic properties, as well as maybe even intrinsic meaning. And the sounds that make up the word moist are some of the sounds that tend to be associated with either body parts or, when you look across languages in the world, or sadness. So those things probably also push us over the edge. If something's already creeping up in that semantic area of, oh, it's associated with things that aren't great, and then it has sounds that make us think of certain things like M sounds and B sounds, which are both bilabial sounds, are very commonly found in words for breasts around the world in languages, probably because of the sounds babies make when they suckle is a bilabial sound. Those are things that kind of gross people out. And again, that association, also M and N sounds are more often in words for nose around, right? Which makes sense because they're made through the nose, they're
Right.
nasal sounds. So, I mean, there's a reason why we have that association. So, there's second hit against it. And then the vowel, the back vowel, that's sort of the first part of the diphthong in oi, is one that tends to be more often in things that evoke sadness or largeness. And so that could also contribute. So, we have all these different factors that probably on their own, none of them really push
Right.
us over the edge, but you combine them together in one single word and boom, there you go on the hatred downslope.
There you go.
Excellent. In the book, you discuss the impact of physiology and psychology on language change. What should our listeners understand about both the interconnectedness and difference between these two influences on our speech?
No matter where you are, who you are, what time period you are, one of the inherent properties of language is that it will change. Because language is built to be flexible. It's part of the nature of its design. There are a lot of different ways and reasons for that, but from an accent perspective, the one that's most important is that when sounds are spoken together rather than in isolation, we don't walk around going, ah, ta, ka, ga. We say things in words, and that combines sounds in different ways all throughout the day. Those sounds influence each other simply by where they are in a word. So if you have a T sound at the beginning of a word versus a T sound in the middle of the word versus a T sound at the end of the word, you're going to see different things happen. At the beginning of a word, it might be aspirated or unaspirated, meaning, there's, depending on the language you speak, there can be a puff of air or some languages not. But if it's in the middle of the word, it's more likely, especially if it's between stressed and unstressed syllables, to weaken or get less fully articulated because it's rapid and between different syllable structures. And so you get things like bottle, right? Or bottle or bottle. Right. So that's the variation that just happens because of the way sounds come together and also because of context, whether you're saying it in the middle of the word, at the end of the word, or in a highly formal situation, informal, all of those things impact just the way we pronounce sounds. That's the physiological perspective, just the way that our mouths change depending on what's happening at that time and place. But that's sort of a constant in language. So whenever we talk, we're always changing things up just by virtue of our physiology and also where those sounds are relative to each other. That's sort of in abstract. It doesn't really matter who you're talking to or what language you're speaking. It's just something that happens. But whenever we're separated by time and distance, what we find is those little changes will happen slightly differently. So the little variations that we make in our speech will happen in different ways depending on which words we're saying more frequently or, who we're talking to the most or the type of contact we might have, right? So over time, a social difference, which is that we don't interact too much, starts to affect the physiological differences so that the same underlying tendencies develop in different ways in different speaker groups. So that's not just geography, though. Any kind of social distance that we develop between us will cause us to speak more like those we speak to a lot and less like those we don't. So that's where this underlying physiology and also our cognitive processing kind of influences us to do certain things with language all the time, like maybe with syllable structure or things like that. That's just a given. But it happens differently the less we talk to each other. And then the more we talk to each other, the more we tend to accommodate, right? And sort of mirror the way that somebody we like speaks. And so that's going to move people that talk a lot together in certain ways and people that hardly ever talk more distant. And so that's where you get this underlying physiology starts to actually sound different in these different speaker groups. But it's still not an accent until someone notices that, oh, there's a social difference between speaker A's group and speaker B's group. And I'm going to assume that that difference in the way they sound is due to that difference in what I socially sort of ascribe to them. So it's really only once we get the socially meaningful association with that difference that we hear it as an accent, because we vary in our speech all the time, every day, and we don't recognize those variations as accents. It's only when there's a social meaningful distinction that gets correlated with some variation in the way we talk that we hear it as an accent.
That's interesting. Yeah. I want to come back to your sound bites. They might be my favorite.
Oh, I love it. I love it because I had to fight with my editor to get those in.
Well, thank
so
God.
I'm so
Thank
happy
God you
I
won.
insisted.
Yeah,
I know.
absolutely. So in the third one, you explore what makes a language beautiful. And I have to say, Valerie, I was saddened to be reminded that German does not rank among languages that we consider romantic. I mean, really? I agree with the language nerds that welche Hälfte vom Brötchen willst du? Which part of the roll would you like? It's one of the most loving things you can ever say to another person. Like, how is that not romantic,
I personally, I'm swooning over here.
But what does the research actually say about the vibes that we get when we hear different languages?
Well, first, I also want to say English is not listed typically among the most romantic languages. I think it's just the Germanic nature of them in general, although I think people will say Swedish is kind of sexy. But anyway, we often hear things like French or Italian, the Romance languages, which is also unfair because they already have the moniker for it, right? Even though it has nothing to do with the type of romance we're talking about, I think people get persuaded by that. There's really interesting research on this question because I think people do strongly feel they have linguistic loves and dislikes, and that we do find certain sounds appealing, certain people talking appealing. In the book, I talk about how I had an Australian boyfriend.
Right.
And really, my greatest attraction to him was his accent. Sure. And that was the hardest thing for me to let go. I was thinking, can I just record you so in posterity I can listen back? So it's hard to explain to ourselves what attracts us to these different accents. But when you look at research on it, there are a number of different things that have been found. The majority of research finds that it's really nothing intrinsic in the language itself that we find more beautiful, but it's about sort of prestige. The prestige we tend to associate with the speakers of that language. It can also be sort of social cultural associations that we have with that language. But really interestingly, it's familiarity is the number one thing that seems to draw us to certain languages over others. So when we do studies where we have people listen to hundreds of different languages, and we compare the results of what they find most attractive. And what they tend to be drawn to the most are languages they think they've heard before. A lot of times they actually are wrong with what they classify those languages as. But if they say they think they recognize it, that tends to increase their likability ratings of that. So that has been really classically found to be one of the greatest determinants of what makes us like a language is its familiarity. And of course, things like French and Italian, we hear a lot more than probably maybe even German to a lot of Americans, but certainly than like Javanese or something like that. But there also do seem to be some tendencies in terms of sound qualities and rhythm qualities that affect which ones we like. There are a couple of things that seem to affect our linguistic aphrodisiacs. One of them seems to be when we have more sonorant consonants and vowels in a language. So sonority is a quality that's essentially how much air pressure is on both sides of the articulation when you're saying a sound. And it's kind of like the loudness and intensity of a sound. But sounds like vowels, for example, are the most sonorant sounds, but L and R, and those are smooth, singable sounds. So a lot of times people have equated sonority with singability. And there's been, some writing about how the more singable a language is, the more people tend to like it. And I think, you look at Italian and opera and the open quality of Italian and French syllables, which tend to be much more open than Germanic languages, that might be the biggest difference between why German is not considered a love language while French and Italian are. because German, like English, has a lot of closed syllables.
Mm-hmm.
So the more sonorant or singable a language, the more people seem to like it. There also seems to be something related to the stress pattern of those languages. So languages that are syllable timed versus stress timed seem to be more attractive. So again, English and German are stress timed, meaning that certain syllables receive more stress
Yep.
than others. So you have this kind of choppy way of articulating it where we're highlighting whatever we want to stand out in the sentence. And we also have different ways we put stress on words in a sentence and within that word itself. So we have this really weird, choppy pattern of stress. And then also we stress this syllable. So that means we have to cram like the next 3 syllables that are unstressed into the same amount of space. So then you just get this really weird, not so rhythmic quality to English. But French and Italian are actually syllable timed where every syllable gets about equal play. And that seems to come across to speakers as more pleasant. So there do seem to be some qualities that make us more attracted to some. Although, if you look at it out in the wash of everything that contributes, familiarity seems to still be the biggest winner in what makes a language sound attractive.
Interesting. So I think I'm going to start singing in German from now on whenever I say something in German, just to see if that will make a difference.
I love it. I think that we should all just sing every day.
Well, apart from that, yes. And I think Sam totally will subscribe to that too.
See, now we know why we like musicals too, right? Because they're singing. They sound melodious. Yes. There's actually one other interesting thing that people have found too is when you have highly intonationally variable speech, that comes across as more attractive. And again, that is something that might be making German take a hit because generally German is a little more of a monotone language than even English. And so it's heard as a little harsher. And last, actually, one other feature that has been found is the more consonants that a language seems to have towards the front of the mouth, people tend to find those more attractive. And of course, German has more back, you have all the sort of guttural, languages with guttural, like Arabic and German are often considered harsher languages. And it's probably because consonants articulated at the back of the mouth tend to become across perceptually that way. So all sorts of fun stuff we can look at in terms of what makes a language beautiful.
Yeah.
And German is not on the winning end of any of them. I'm so sorry.
Poor German.
It's okay. It's okay.
Personally, I love German. I actually really do.
I think I've told this story on the podcast before at some point probably, but I have a very clear memory of, 20 odd years ago, my middle school French teacher talking about how certain words in different languages sound like the thing they are. And she used the example of, in English, butterfly, really sound like in Spanish, mariposa, in French, papillon. And then she said, and I remember she climbed up on a little footstool when she said, in German, Schmetterling. and I still remember her making the wing flapping sounds and saying that this butterfly wears combat boots and has a 50-foot wingspan.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what schmettern means, right? I mean, that's when a sound is really loud, you schmetter something.
Well, she was married to the German teacher at my middle school also. So for whatever, take that as you will.
She was trying to give it a hit wherever she could, right?
All right. So you also go into some detail about the quote-unquote race of certain accents. And as you point out, the voices that people think of as, for example, white or black are sociocultural inheritances, not genetic. Last season, we spoke with Dominique Branson about linguistic bias in the American justice system and how many jurors associate the voices of black speakers with criminality, and have found this in studies. Can you expand on all this based on what you've learned writing this book?
Sure. There is a lot of research, unfortunately, about how these associations that jurors come into the courtroom with affect the way that they believe witnesses. So defendants and witnesses. I think, there was a very famous case where one in the George Zimmerman trial, which was a white man accused of killing a African-American man. He claimed self-defense. And so there was a trial about whether he had in fact murdered him or it was self-defense. And one of the key witnesses for the prosecution was a witness who spoke with an African American accent or an African American English. And it was a fairly heavy African American English accent. So she was not very comprehensible, they claimed, and they couldn't understand what she was saying. And in fact, the prosecutor himself, whose witness it was, continually acted like she was an idiot on the witness stand. I mean, I've watched it. It's kind of horrifying that to his own witness, who presumably he had spoken to before she got on the witness stand,
Right.
he demeaned her and her basically acted like she was completely incomprehensible on the witness stand. And a lot of that does seem to affect the way that jurors come up with their verdict. So here we have, a prosecutor that's acting like she can't be believed because of what she's saying. So, of course, that's going to send a message to jurors. But even the attitudes that jurors walk in with, which is that African American English speakers tend to be, or people with those accents tend to be more associated with weapons and criminality and violence, which we find with implicit association tests to be true, will prejudice them to find those people more guilty. But it's not just African American English. We find that a lot of working class accents that are associated with toughness or sort of areas that are maybe socioeconomically disadvantaged tend to have those same influences on jurors. And in fact, there was a study on the Brummie accent in Britain where the same thing was found, that people that come into a courtroom with a Brummie accent, which is also an accent that's not widely favored in Britain, that's seen as sort of a lower class, tough accent, they also tended to get much higher levels of guilty verdicts on those. So we certainly find that this isn't true of just one accent. It tends to be true of socially non-prestigious accents in general. One of the complaints that people say is they can't understand them. Other ones is just that, you tend to associate in media and television the accents that tend to be parlayed with people that represent gang membership or violence or hold weapons are often characterized with such accents. And therefore, that kind of has a tendency to influence how people think about them. The reality of African American English is, first of all, any associations we have with things like gangs or violence or sort of gangsta life, as it's been called, those are really things that are in part largely due to the media's transmittal of those forms of English. So these characterizations that we tend to see on television and radio, and when we hear those accents, what they tend to be about, which doesn't really pay heed to the fact that African American English is not just one thing, it's many things. And there are, first of all, many different varieties of African American English, not just the vernacular form, which is what we tend to hear the most, and in negative ways. There's actually a large number of African American varieties that are middle class varieties and standard varieties that don't get the same kind of airplay or discussion that the vernacular forms do. The other thing is the vernacular forms tend to be highlighted in sort of images of degradation, as one scholar said, that when we hear it, it tends to be in negative context. So all of those things are going to feed our beliefs about speakers of those accents. Another thing is that it's only African American English speakers, and that all African American English speakers speak that variety, which also isn't true.
Right.
There are a lot of African American English speakers that don't speak that variety. It is the case that there are more African American English speakers that speak that variety, which is why it's called that. And its history is actually out of an African American culture that grew in the 20th century after the Great Migration. So, of course, that's why it has that name. But there are also, because of its popularity in hip hop and social media now, where it's more accessible, there are lots of people all over the world that actually use certain features from African American vernacular English, or maybe even our speakers themselves. So I think what I really found in writing this chapter is there's a lot of myths about African American English. There is certainly a correlation with children that speak African American vernacular English and reading failure in schools. But the reasons why that is the case are probably not the ones that people most likely assume. So if you think about why that might be, one is that, children go into that classroom with a bigger divide between the language at home and the language in the school than a child from a middle-class white background who probably speaks something closer to the standard English that's being taught. So you're already, it's like having a kid with a non-native accent go into the school. They have more distance to surmount simply because of the medium of instruction is different. There's also a devaluation of the culture and background and history of that variety. So instead of understanding where it's coming from and the fact that it's actually really a historically fascinating development to African American English, it goes back to colonial days. A lot of its most famous features, like saying ax for ask, is actually a colonial variant that was inherited in that variety and lost in others, even though it was extremely prevalent in colonial days in all varieties of American English. We find it really well evidenced in the historical records we have from those times, like documents and trial transcripts. But we ignore that part of it, tell children that their speech variety is a bad one and they need to get rid of it. And then we also don't provide them resources to help them understand the sort of sound grapheme correspondences that might be different for them. So we're not providing them the tools either. So it's not about them not having the capacity, right, to do better at reading. It's that we're not really giving them the tools to do better. So yeah, I think I found there's really some interesting things that are relevant to a lot of debates about our sort of social cultural relationships, debates about our criminal justice system, and debates about our educational failures.
Right.
So it was a fascinating chapter to write.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Valerie, what does your crystal ball tell us about the future of accents? You mentioned screenbound teens in your book, and that made me wonder whether the rise of global social networking apps like TikTok suggests changes in the spoken language in the years to come. Like, will there even be interpersonal communication between actual humans in the age of TikTok and AI?
I sure hope so. I think when you walk to a restaurant now and everybody's on their phone, it makes you there won't be. I think what we do is ignore that we still have interaction. It's just of a different form, and the form has changed so drastically from what television does, right? What radio has done. Both of those were forms that worried people when they came in about their effects on learning, their effects on communication. But one of the things that's been radically different between, that whole set of worries and the advent of television and radio, and then the advent and growth of social media, is that the way that we interact is fundamentally different with social media and the internet. So whereas television is sort of one-sided and non-interactive, I mean, no one knows you on that side. You don't feel like they know you. I mean, you might have fantasies about it, but that's not real. But when we interact on social media, a lot of times it's almost in real time, right? So people are interacting at that moment with each other. And sometimes you could put something out and someone does respond to it. So there is that personal interaction. But also when we post videos or, different kinds of TikTok dances, it looks like you're being in an intimate conversation one-on-one with someone. So different than television, which is sort of something you're a voyeur in, where in social media, you're an interactive participant, even if you're not actually interacting one-on-one with that real person, which is why we get so much weird parasocial stuff happening. So it is a fundamental change in the way that we interact. And, I laugh because I had, a teenage daughter, and she will literally be sitting in a room with a friend and they are talking to each other on their phones.
Yes. It is mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling. Yes, absolutely. So I feel like, they definitely are taking a hit in their interpersonal, in-person skills, but they're not necessarily taking a hit in terms of the fact that they're not interacting at all. And that seems to be the crux of what's happening in its shaping of speech. I mean, first, I think it's Adam Alexei wrote a book that's about sort of the algorithms of social media and how it really magnifies certain traits and trends by what it picks as sort of viral posts and what it pushes up on your feed, and that things that are extreme tend to make it more often to those sides, which is why we see such extremism online. But what it also does is it kind of tends to reuse the same words over time, which certainly has an impact on what young people are saying. So, are they sharing language in ways that they didn't before across geographic divides? Absolutely. Words go viral in a way they never did before. You wrote them on the bathroom wall when I was in high school. Now you write them on the social media posts and you reach a lot more people. So one change of the future is things that used to be local and words that used to be local and take on meaning in that context are no longer limited to the local, and they have become global. So that's for sure a big change. But that's at the level of vocabulary, which I don't think is that surprising in some ways.
Sure.
Right.
But it is bringing people closer together. And then when you also have that, when we're getting the same cultural zeitgeist, because we're expressing ourselves in this medium that joins us in a way, what that also does is make us feel more connected to each other. And connection is really what gets us talking the same way.
Right.
So what we're losing is a connection to the local. Because all of this is boiling down to we're spending time with people that are not in our local communities and networks.
Right.
And so it's not so much that we're sounding more like someone overseas that's on our same sort of channels or feeds. We're sounding less like the people that we grew up with because we're just not interacting with that group as much. And so I think my predicating the future would be that we sound more similar because we're sounding less local, not because we're necessarily sounding more alike on a phonological level. So in terms of our accents. At a level of vocabulary, I think absolutely social media is also making that more homogenized and bringing us closer together. That said, that's sort of in terms of regional boundaries, the way we kind of communicate across space. What hasn't changed, and I think you can absolutely see this in today's society, is our divisiveness in terms of seeing ourselves as members of different groups with belief systems. So I think where we're seeing the shift is we're having less geographic accents that tie to localness and more ideological accents that tie to belief systems and values and networks. So African American English, for example, there's a huge community online of that. And so maybe you get less local African American English variety, but you certainly aren't getting less ethnic kind of belonging in the African American community. And in fact, I think the connection online that has made that community more visible, not just within the community, but outside of it, has actually intensified the ethno-linguistic divides. Ideologically with politics, there's been actually some really interesting literature on how politics has shaped us sounding different. And I think a lot of people would say that they can tell if someone's liberal or conservative sometimes from the way they sound. So ideologically, we're moving in ways that I actually think will shape our speech so that dialects and accents are not dead. They're just changing their nature.
Interesting.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you for such a detailed response to that.
Yeah, sorry, it was a long one, but it's such a fascinating area.
It is, and that's why we're so happy to have you here. And I want to ask, now that this book is available at booksellers everywhere, what's your next project?
I am really, I have a few different ideas. I'm really debating whether I want to write another book right away. In this business, that tends to be sort of the way it works. You have to jump right on the bandwagon. I actually do have two fairly well-developed ideas for follow-up books, but they shall remain secret or else I'd have to kill you. I am interested in also AI and its impact on language. But I also have some other ideas. I have a really fun idea for a sort of this show I'd like to do that it's sort of the Nova of language.
Ooh.
Because there's so much fascinating, so many fascinating topics to deal with language. And, there's a lot of podcasts around language where people talk about what they specialize in. But I think there are actually a lot of sort of really cool, larger topics that could do with a full hour of development. Like, the search for the first language. What do we know? Those kinds of things. How do babies' brains soak up the language of their environment, and what helps and what hurts, those kinds of things. Social media and what we know about its impact on, not just the accents of our future, but the way that we, communicate in terms of the topics that we talk about and, the sort of future of what we think about. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. I haven't decided how to do it. That's part B. So I don't know yet what I'm doing. I'm teaching. I'm still teaching. I'll be teaching back in the classroom in the fall. So I have to work this in among my scholarly duties. I also have a couple of research papers that I'm working on. So yeah, I'm still a blank slate. I have ideas. I haven't completely decided what the next phase will be.
Excellent. And we're here for all of it as it develops.
Absolutely.
So Valerie, where can our listeners find out more about you, all your books, and all your other work?
I have a website, valeriefridland.com, that lists a lot of sort of the latest things I'm doing. It tells you more about my books, my research, and also some of the articles I've been writing. I also have a blog that appears monthly on Psychology Today called Language in the Wild, and I do sort of different fun linguistic topics every month in that. I guest write for Grammar Girl, the podcast, as well. So you can often listen to some of her podcasts, which is a great podcast as it is, but I sometimes write for it as well. So there's lots of places to find me. And of course, I would love it if people wanted to check out my new book, Why We Talk Funny, or my old book, like Literally Dude.
Terrific. Well, once again, Valerie, it's been so great to talk about all of these things with you. It's a treat to have you here. And before we sign off, we'd once again like to ask you for a word in a language you love, are learning, maybe want to learn, that makes you feel inspired. What word do you have for us today?
Well, this is a funny one because I was just in Germany at a workshop, and it was awesome. It was in Kiel, which is sort of northern Germany, and they did this wonderful thing. I mean, it was a bunch of linguists, so you can see what happens when you get linguists together. They had a coffee cup for everybody in the workshop made up, and you got to pick which one you liked, and they had words, local words, and their definitions on each. And so the one I got was Schiedwetter.
Nice.
Which, considering I was there at a very rainy time, it seemed to be the perfect expression of everything I felt. It was so cross-culturally accessible to me that I thought that one was a great word. So I just brought that home, and I see it every morning when I have my coffee. So I actually really love German. I have so many good German friends, and that really made me want to learn more. The other word they had was moin moin. Which is sort of the northern, right? Good morning.
Yep.
That was really fun. So, I'm doing that, and I'm also trying to kind of relearn some French. So those are the things I'm working at. But Schiedwetter was sort of my word of the year.
I like it. Well, and living in upstate New York, that basically describes about 80% of the weather here.
Especially this year.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, Valerie, it is always such a treat speaking with you. Thank you for the amazing books that you put out there. And thank you so much for speaking of language with us today.
It was so much fun. Thanks for having me.
All right, dear listeners, with this episode, we are wrapping up season 17.
Don't forget to get your copy of Why We Talk Funny for your summer reading pleasure. Listen to all our previous episodes over the next few months and stay tuned for season 18 in the fall.
Until then,
Auf Wiederhören.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
and follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.
That's
So much
a
fun.
wrap.